Welcome to the last session of today's track. This will be a keynote by Larry Garfield, whom I am very proud to introduce and welcome here in Sofia. Larry, as most of you know, is very involved in the Drupal community. He's the architect of the Drupal 7 database system. He's also in charge of Drupal 8 web services, and he's a consultant. He's a senior architect in Palantir, and enjoy, guys.
All right. Здравейте, Sofia. Knew I was going to get something wrong there. I tried. All right. So, as I said, my name is Larry Garfield. Some of you may know me online as Krell. If you want to make fun of me on Twitter during the session, that's where you do so. I highly encourage it. I'm a senior architect with Palantir.net. We're a web agency based in Chicago. We do mostly Drupal, but not exclusively. For Drupal 8, I was the Web Services Initiative lead, which means you can blame me for about half of what you're about to see. Drupal representative to the Framework Interoperability Group. Does everyone know what the FIG is? It's basically the United Nations of PHP, with all the good and bad implications that has. Advisor to the Drupal Association, and a walking implementation of PSR8. Some people get that. So, you enjoying the conference so far? Good sessions, all right. I've seen some pretty good sessions here. Lots of talks on, how to develop nice, good, clean code that looks like this. This is the kind of code we all want to have, right? Modular, easily buildable. You can play around with it, reconfigure it, clean, easy to understand. But let's be honest. Who's going home to write code to look at code that looks like this? Right? So about half of you are willing to own up to it. So if this is where we are, this is what we have now, how do we get to here? Can we get to here from here? Yes. Yes, we can. It is, in fact, possible to evolve spaghetti into Legos. How to do that? The key target I would give you is testability. If you want to know how to evolve your code in order to make it more Lego-like, evolve towards testability. That is your target. Why testability? Testability on its own is not enough, but testability is a decent proxy for loosely coupled code or fully decoupled code. Code that is cleanly injectable, code that's reusable, code that's easy to understand, good code. All of these things are similar to and driven by testability. As an example, when you're dealing on the front end, you have good, clean semantic markup, you have SEO-friendly and Google-friendly markup, and you have markup that's good for accessibility, for screen readers. Those are not the same thing, but they're all close enough that if you target one and get that one really right, if you focus on accessibility, you're probably going to do pretty well on SEO just along the way. Same idea here. These are not all the same thing, but by focusing on testability, we can get a pretty good approximation of all of these. Which means that if you look at your code and you can't test it, that's your problem. Fix it. Now, is it actually possible to make this kind of evolution? Well, personal story time. Who's heard of Drupal 7? Some of you don't have your hands up? What am I doing here? Who's used the Drupal 7? Okay. PHP 7 is a PHP 4 era system. It requires PHP 5, but it is architecturally a PHP 4 era application. It is array-oriented. It's not object-oriented. It's hardly procedural. It's array-oriented. We've got all these arrays that define everything. And lots of functional tests. Those who are just here for the last session, Drupal 7 has lots of tests up at the top of that stack. Not a good thing. It gets the job done, but not a good thing. And a very idiomatic architecture. I'll be polite. But it's very extensible, very flexible, which means that it's able to run 2% of the web, which 2% doesn't sound large, but consider that means 1 in 50 websites, 1 in 40 websites in the world runs Drupal. And when you go up the scale, larger and larger sites, the larger and larger percentage of the market is Drupal. It's like 15 to 20% of the top 1,000 sites on the web are running Drupal. Lots of governments adopt it. In the United States, at least, roughly a quarter of all universities run Drupal. It's a huge part of the market. So really, and that was from a massive community. There were nearly 1,000 people who contributed to Drupal 7. This is larger than most companies. And this is just the people writing code for Drupal 7, to say nothing of documentation or anything else. So really, it's a very powerful system, but let's be honest, those who have worked with it know it's really straining at the seams. Drupal 8, which goes into release candidate in about a week and a half, is a fundamentally object-oriented system. We now have, as of the last time I checked, about 8,500 unit tests. That number keeps going up in addition to our integration tests, which means that our code is improved to make it possible to have 8,000 unit tests. The architecture is even more flexible than in earlier versions. It's built on modern standards, so it's far less idiomatic, much easier to approach, much easier to work with. We've embraced proudly invented elsewhere, because let's face it, everybody loves pie, right? And more than 3 times as many contributors. This is, as of like 2 weeks ago I last checked, over 3,000 people who have worked on Drupal 8. That's a lot. How does one turn Drupal 7 into Drupal 8? That's a huge task. Well, how does one attack a huge task? How does one eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And it helps if you have friends. Lots and lots of friends. This is DrupalCon Portland, over 3,000 people. This is in 2012, 13? I forget which one. So how did that come about? Well, it started with whiskey. I don't mean the kind you drink. I mean the Web Services and Context Core Initiative. This is the core initiative that I ran for Drupal 8. And we set out in 2011 with this mission statement. We need to evolve from a first-class web CMS into a first-class REST server that includes a CMS. Because that's the way the web is going. We need APIs baked in. We need the support for doing web APIs at a low level. Important thing to note here, rewriting the whole system was not what we set out to do. What we set out to do was improve functionality, was build a better application. Getting to a cleaner system was the way we got there. It was a necessary step to getting to those kind of improvements. Because we really wanted to do the new stuff the right way. This is something I insisted on. If we're going to write a lot of new stuff, let's do it right the first time. Let's not keep piling on top of cruft. And we also said, you know what? We can't be the first ones to do this. We're not the only PHP project that wants to do REST. We're not the only PHP project that needs to get away from super globals. Hasn't somebody done this before? Hasn't somebody written something here we can use? Funny story. Yes. As you may or may not have heard, Drupal has adopted a lot of Symfony components. The first one we pulled in was just the basic HTTP Foundation request and response libraries. After that, we decided to pull in the full kernel, and it snowballed from there to the point that in Drupal 8, we've now pulled in dozens of packages from third parties. We've got not all of Symfony 2, but about 8 or 9 packages. Symfony CMF, we actually collaborated with them on some code. We've got code from Zen, code from Doctrine, Guzzle, Twig. If those of you who have worked with Drupal before, this is a huge, huge change that we're actually using and trusting code we didn't write. That's a huge cultural shift. And so what I want to talk about today is to share our experiences so that you can learn from our experience rebuilding Drupal 8. And by experiences, I, of course, mean mistakes, because, let's face it, we didn't get everything right. We never do. But it's a learning experience. And probably the biggest thing I want to call out is that refactoring, rebuilding a system, modernizing an ecosystem is not a technical challenge. It's a social challenge. It's a governance challenge. This is true whether we're talking about an open source project like Drupal, or an in-house application at a company, or a commercial application. Whatever it is, you need the leadership buy-in. You need buy-in from the top of the organization, and even an open source project has leadership and management in it. If you just try and do it stealthy and bit by bit, it will be short-lived because you're not actually starting a movement. You're not actually changing the culture. Technical changes on their own don't last. First guideline, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So ask yourself, are you refactoring for the sake of refactoring, or are you creating features and refactoring in the process? Neither of these is necessarily wrong. In Drupal's case, we wanted new functionality. We needed new functionality. Doing stuff in a new way, doing it in an object-oriented way, doing test-driven development was a means to an end for most people, which meant that a lot of people got taken by surprise when we said, oh, we're going to change all of this stuff. I'm like, what? Because that's not what we actually set out to do. It's just how we set out to do it. Changing things and refactoring for its own sake came years later. But people need to see value. The people you're working with need to be able to see the value of these changes. That's why we started off targeting features. Other developers need to see value in changing the code they're used to working with, in changing the code they've already written. And management needs to see value. Why are we spending all this time changing code that already works, for some definition of works? You need to get that buy-in from management and from the developers. Is it valuable? People will ask, is this task you're proposing valuable? Is it going to actually buy us something? You may have heard this quote. Who's heard some variant of this line? Code quality doesn't matter, only user experience matters? A couple of people? Yeah, I hear it all the time, and the answer is wrong. Why is this wrong? Well, developers are users. They're users of the code. If the code is hard to work with, if the code is brittle, you cannot write new user-facing features. How are you going to write new user-facing functionality if the code you're working with is crap? You can't. You have to fix the code. Technical debt drags down your ability to build user-facing functionality. You cannot serve your users without first serving your developers. You may say that the new code will be better, may make this claim, and the answer is going to be, I'll believe it when I see it. But of course, that doesn't mean you actually have permission to do it so that they can see it. Yeah. So how do you break that? Well, in Drupal's case, our first look at this new style, a modern code base, was our database layer in Drupal 7. This is the main thing I did in Drupal 7 was our database layer. It was a completely homegrown system. At the time, Doctrine did not have a separate deval from an ORM, so we couldn't use the entire system. If we were doing it today, we might use that, but at this point, we just did our own. But it was a completely object-oriented system through and through, with a couple of procedural wrappers around it for convenience. And it meant that we could say, you know what, procedural people used to arrays of doom. This is not so scary. This new style code actually does work. It is, in fact, easier. There were numerous cases, in fact, of developers working on Drupal contributed modules who said, I was able to remove 600 lines of code from my module and just replace it with a couple of method calls to this API. That's good. That's how you get that initial buy-in, by demonstrating the value, demonstrating, oh, my life is easier when I do it this new way. This was back in 2008 that we started working on it. This is not a fast process. I've been working on this effort in some form or another for a very long time. The big change, though, came early in the Drupal 8 cycle with our routing system. Again, this is the area I was working on. The routing system in Drupal 7 only knew about paths. So if we wanted to do anything with different accept headers, different HTTP methods, all the things you kind of have to do for a REST system, it just couldn't handle it. There were a lot of systems that people had built on top of it that were horribly ugly. So we wanted to rip that out, replace it with something good, and just restify our entire routing system. And we ended up doing that by using Symfony, or specifically Symfony HTTP kernel and the CMF, Symfony CMF router that ended up being a collaboration between Drupal and the Symfony CMF team. Because we said, the world doesn't need another request object, so let's reuse it. In a sense, from a refactoring standpoint, we were a little bit underhanded. Just take HTTP kernel, Drop it in the middle of this procedural system. You take this big object-oriented subsystem and drop it right in the middle and let things ripple out. Because you want to make the old code feel clunkier in comparison. So people who are working on the system could say, oh, I'm working with this new stuff and this old stuff, and wow, this new stuff is really a lot nicer, isn't it? It's easier to understand, it's easier to work with, it's easier to test, which means that it has fewer bugs, and so forth. You're trying to give people an emotional response so that they can say, I feel better working with the new code than the old code, and then you'll get people working with you. But it's important when doing this to make sure you're shaming the old code, not the coders. You don't want to shame the people who wrote the code you're trying to replace. Why? Well, first of all, there's a 50-50 chance you wrote it. Even if it's not something you wrote, you don't want people fighting you. If you make fun of the developers who wrote the code you're replacing, guess who's not going to help you rewrite it? You want allies, not enemies. You want friends, not people who are going to fight you. So there's two different ways we talked about here that we could go about refactoring a system. We could either go bottom up with just starting with subsystems, or we could go top down by hitting right in the middle. Which one is better? What's that?
I would say, depending on the task, but the second one sounds the straighter way.
Second one sounds the straighter way? Maybe. Taking a bottom-up approach, well, there's a couple of pros here. You can tackle the low-hanging fruit very easily. In most systems, there's going to be a lot of easy tasks here, a lot of easy wins. It's easier to parallelize. I could be working on the database system, someone else could be working on forms, someone else could be working on, I don't know, templating or whatever. And we're not actually going to bump into each other because those systems shouldn't talk to each other. They really shouldn't, right? Right? Okay. It allows you to unravel these knots bit by bit. You don't hit one giant knot that you have to unravel. On the other hand, it really is a low-incentive approach. The procedural stuff, the sloppy stuff, the untestable stuff, it still works. Why am I going to bother refactoring it? There's a lot less impact. You know, if I want to test something, if I've got a system that is completely untestable except with integration tests, and I just start nibbling around the edges, I still have to use integration tests for the vast majority of it until the very end. And at some point, you're going to have to make that big break. At some point, you're going to change your core system, and that's going to be painful. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable. And sometimes it's better to pull off the Band-Aid all at once. With taking a top-down approach, you can hit the high-visibility stuff first. Everyone was touched by the routing system. When we started replacing the very core of Drupal, everyone noticed. Everyone knew something was happening. It also meant we could identify those major knots and say, oh, boy, ooh, wow, okay, that's going to take a while. Because it's something right next to some really clean code, and we can see, oh, wow, in order to refactor this one piece, there's 15 other dependencies here we have to refactor too. So now we know, oh, that's what we're going to work on next. And it gives you a better contrast with the old code. So you can, if you're forced to work with both of them at once, you can see the difference and see the benefits of it. On the other hand, it's much higher risk. When you start changing major subsystems in the bottom of your system, you run the risk of breaking all the things. And you don't necessarily know what you're doing. So that could end very badly. You run into lots of knots, way more than you expected. Do you have the time? Do you have the planning in place to tackle that large of a task? And you may forget the low-hanging fruit. Sometimes you just want to refactor something easy to get something moving. And if you start with the big stuff, you may not even get to some of that low-hanging fruit. Good example here. Drupal, it has a messaging system, so you can set messages that get shown to the user. It goes through the session, similar to Symfony Flash messages, same idea. The API for that is still procedural. Why? Not for any good reason, just we never got around to that one. We'll fix it in 8.1, I promise, but really? So don't forget those. So which is better? So still want to say top-down? Not really? The right approach technically and politically may be different. Technically, from a technical standpoint, I'll say it's probably easier to go bottom-up because you can nibble off systems, work in parallel, have different teams working on things, unravel bit by bit. But sometimes you need the marketing value. You need the political value of saying, we're changing. And in Drupal's case, I think it was necessary to have that really big, impactful change early to say, you know what, this is going to be a big deal. Get on board. And you need very, very clear messaging around this, around your plan, around what you're doing and how you're doing it. And you need to repeat it. Why do you need to repeat it? Because everyone wants to hear it themselves. The Whiskey Initiative started in early 2011. And I had lots of blog posts, lots of IRC conversations, public discussions, forums, talks at conferences, repeating the same message over and over again in different ways for different audiences. And it was a year later, I still had people coming up to me at conferences and going, so Larry, I hear about this whiskey thing you're doing. What is that? Are you paying attention at all? Have you heard anything I've said in the last year? Nope. It's a complete and total waste of your time to repeat yourself this much. It's an even bigger waste of your time when it's your senior engineers who are doing this marketing and evangelism rather than writing code. It's a complete and total waste of your time that you will have to do anyway. This one took me a very long time to internalize because I wanted to just write code. But no, it was more important for me to spend time on stages and in blog posts convincing people of this and letting other people I was working with actually make those changes. Because there are costs to poor messaging. Not everyone's going to learn this new stuff at the same rate. Some people will pick up OO code or pick up test-driven development like that, no problem. Others, it's going to take them a while, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, a couple of years. It's not because they're bad, not because they're stupid, just different people learn at different rates, and you have to account for that. And not everyone's going to like it. If you are super-duper familiar with the current system and someone proposes changing everything, that means your skill set is no longer relevant. Not everyone likes it when their skill set becomes no longer relevant. And not everyone is going to want to stay around. If it's an open source project, you could have people leave. If it's a company, you could have people quit because they don't want to spend time changing their system. Or worst case, they don't quit and fight you on it. In an extreme case, in Drupal's case, we had a fork about 2 years ago called Backdrop that is Drupal for people who don't like the OO stuff, essentially. I don't expect it to last in the market, but it's there because we couldn't bring along everyone. You have to ask, are the benefits going to be worth it? Are you going to get more people into your project than you lose? Are you going to be able to attract more developers to your company by making these changes? Personally, I think absolutely yes. Judging by what we've seen with Drupal so far, absolutely yes. That may not be true for everybody or in every project. Amateurs think about tactics, professionals think about logistics. Do we have any dev managers, project managers, coordination type people in the room? A couple? Okay. This is something I said very early in the dev cycle. Drupal is, of course, almost entirely volunteer-driven. And I pointed out, if you give me 5 people 10 hours a week, I can recode anything you want. Give me 50 people for an hour a week, I can't do diddly-squat. Because work does not happen in 1-hour increments. Real work happens in 4-hour increments. Meetings happen in 1-hour increments. But meetings don't fix code. We never quite solved this one. Until recently when more people started to get paid to work on Drupal core. Work does not happen in your spare time. Sounds weird coming from an open source developer, but let's be honest. Who works at an agency of some kind? Consulting? A decent number of people? Okay. How often do you actually get to work on in-house projects that are not billable? Exactly. You need to have committed time. You need to have focused time. You need to actually commit to doing this kind of work, not just say, it'd be nice if it gets done in between other tasks. That will never happen. One of the best tools for that is sprints. I don't mean agile sprints. I mean in-person collaboration. Drupal is one of the largest distributed development teams in the world, and we still work best in person. By sprints, I mean in-person collaboration with a small group with dedicated time for the right people can get a lot done. If you give people 3 days, 3 people 3 days to get something done, they can do an incredible amount of work. But you have to give them the space to work and get out of their way. Dev managers, that means stop asking for reports every 3 hours. You also have to be aware of bike shedding. You're all familiar with the concept of a bike shed, right? If you try and build a nuclear reactor, then everyone's going to be okay with it and your plans for it because no one actually understands how nuclear reactors work, so they'll just nod and smile. But if you try and build a bike shed, everyone has an opinion all of a sudden. Yeah. Best example here, our configuration system. It's probably the most important user-facing change in Drupal 8. For those familiar with Drupal 7, think features module no longer necessary. The staging and deployment problem for all the configuration-heavy systems that Drupal has solved. We met back in 2011 in June for a 3-day sprint in Denver. I was one of the people here. And we worked through, how's this going to work? What do we need? What's our requirements? How are we going to work about it? What's the API going to look like? What about this problem? What about this problem? What about this problem? Came up with a very detailed recommendation that we brought back to the community to post publicly for comments. The plan was we had files on disk that were storing configuration rather than in the database. We had a detailed system for how we're going to load things efficiently. We had an API defined for it. We had a system figured out for how we're going to do staging of configuration changes. And really the only open question was, are those files going to be JSON, YAML, or XML? Guess what the only thing anyone cared to talk about was? 400 comments later, we're still arguing about the file format. I mean, really, we're professionals, aren't we? Eventually, we did settle on JSON because it was nice and easy to parse. Later on, we moved to YAML for the simple reason that JSON doesn't have inline documentation, and we kind of needed that. In hindsight, to be perfectly honest, XML would have fit our end use case better, given where we ended up. But unfortunately, most web developers are allergic to angle brackets when they appear on the server, so no one was willing to do that. Whatever. So how do you stop bike sheds? Prayer. You need really strong leadership. And by strong leadership, I don't mean dictators. I mean someone who can actually lead. Strong leaders know how and when to say shut up in a way that people appreciate. You need a very clear decision-making process. At the end of the day, who gets to decide which file format we're using? Everyone present needs to know whose decision it is at the end of the day and what that process is, whatever it is. If it's pure consensus, you're doomed. Is it this one person? Is it these 5 people? Is it a vote? Whatever it is, it needs to be clear. And you need to over-communicate. We didn't go into detail enough in that first report about what we were actually recommending and why, and especially the why. Later sprints we had recommendations we came back with. We went into a lot more detail about the 7 things we rejected, and it helped a lot to keep people from bike shedding again. And it helps to be lucky. Sometimes that's all you can count on. So now that we know what we're doing, we know how we're going to do it, how do you actually get it done? Well, as the British say, proper prior planning prevents piss-poor performance. Notice a pattern emerging? First of all, don't write unit tests. What? Really, no, it's okay. Start with system tests, not unit tests. Why? If it was possible to write unit tests, we would be done. That's the point. That's why we're doing it. And yet those unit tests are going to change as you rewrite the units. Don't waste time trying to unit test something that is untestable that you're about to replace. That is an unnecessary waste of your time. Write unit tests for all the new stuff you write, and let the new stuff eventually overtake the old stuff. And along the way, you don't want to break user functionality. That's what those integration tests are for. That's what those system tests are for. That way you can say, I've completely rewritten the code under the hood, but the user can still log in, and I can prove it with tests. It also means you want 100% green tests at all times. If at any point you commit something and your test suite does not completely pass, you stop immediately and fix that. Otherwise, you can't trust your tests for anything else you do until you fix that. Green test passage at all times. No exceptions. In our case, we wrote our own testing framework. Because it was 2008, I apologize, whatever. PHP unit was not quite as dominant as it was these days. But having those tests saved us over and over again, daily. Saves us from screwing ourselves over horribly. These days, use Behat, use Selenium, use whatever you want. Don't write your own, please. But have some kind of integration tests, some kind of system tests running. Again, when we wrote our own, neither of these existed. Travis didn't exist, whatever. Do something, whatever it is. But also keep in mind that your functional tests are for functionality. They are not a surrogate for unit testing. And if you try to use a system testing framework as a fake unit testing framework, you will hate yourself. Believe me, I do. Because that's going to be extremely brittle, extremely slow, and even more work to change and fix when you change the actual code to fix it up. So don't do that. And then share. So that is the nature of modern PHP, is sharing. Who's made this statement at some point? I don't want to maintain crappy code, especially my own. A couple of people are going to admit it, and a couple more people are going to admit it. Okay. Good. Use someone else's instead. That way, they get to maintain it instead. These days, this is super duper easy. Composer and Packagist. Symfony has packages. Zend has packages. Aura has packages. Easy Components has packages. We have a buffet of pre-existing code you can use so that you don't have to write your own code and have to maintain your own code. That is the entire point of open source, is so that you don't have to maintain your own crappy version of something. You can use someone else's, hopefully not crappy, version of it. If you have new functionality that you need to add to your system, don't look to writing code when you start. Your first response should be looking for existing code that you can just pull in and use. There's plenty. For example, our new configuration system ended up using YAML. We never really thought about writing our own YAML parser, because Symfony had one, and so why would we bother? Yeah, don't waste your time on that. If you have to build something new, share it with yourself. Build new functionality in a new, clean way. Don't hamstring yourself by your current architecture. Build the system you want to have piece by piece. Do it right. If you're writing new functionality, do that right. Take the time to do new stuff correctly, and then release it back to yourself. Share it on Packagist and pull it in via Composer. That's actually a very good way of doing it, and it forces you to keep clean separation between your systems. In Drupal's case, we have a part of our codebase set aside for freestanding non-Drupal dependent components that we are in the process of setting up to release on Packagist, independent of Drupal itself. For existing functionality that you're trying to fix up, trying to improve, who's heard this statement? Don't try and replace your app wholesale, refactor it in place, otherwise you will never, ever, ever finish. Completely true. But for existing subsystems, frequently the better choice is to just trash the subsystem and replace it, which we did a lot of in Drupal. My favorite example here, Drupal HTTP request. This is Drupal's HTTP 1 client. Yes, I said 1, not 1.1. It is one single 304-line function. Yeah, you can start laughing now. With an end-path complexity of 25 billion. To try and put that in perspective, if you started writing unit tests for that today, you would not finish before the heat death of the universe. And even then, it still lacks a number of features that are kind of basic these days, like you couldn't actually send requests through a proxy. Oi! So how do we fix that? How do we refactor that? You don't. We replace it with Guzzle. Because Guzzle does way more than what we could, and it was already existed, and it was well tested, and the developer was willing to work with us and actually break up the packages so we could pull in just the core parts we wanted. This saved us, 2,000, 4,000 hours worth of time. Now that said, outsourcing does have costs. Don't change something just for the sake of changing it. If you're using a third-party code, you don't actually have the ability to change it on a moment's notice. You have to wait on someone else to fix bugs. You don't necessarily have exactly the right architecture in it that you need. In our case, Drupal 8 still uses our own homegrown database layer. Could we have switched to Doctrine? Probably, but the database layer was like the only part of the system that was clean object-oriented code, so why replace that? There's plenty of other things to work on. You also need to automate everything. I mentioned full test passage. You want 100% green tests at all time? CI server. If you don't have a CI server, it will not happen. You cannot rely on developers to manually run tests for everything. It's just not going to be a thing. These days, again, we built our own. Please don't. Do something with Jenkins. Use Travis CI. Use Circle CI. Use some kind of service. I don't care what it is. Use something so that you have continuous integration tests. And that includes performance. We didn't have automated testing for performance, which meant that Drupal 8 got steadily slower, bit by bit, throughout the entire development cycle. Not because object-oriented code is inherently slower, but because all of that refactoring broke all of our old performance optimizations. The performance profile is completely different. Now, we've managed to claw most of that back at this point. The architecture is different enough that under certain circumstances, Drupal 8 is actually considerably faster than Drupal 7. In others, it's considerably slower. Most of them faster. But you need to keep this in mind. If you are not constantly automatically checking it, if you don't have robots doing this for you, you will forget to do it. And finally, the best is the enemy of the good. Okay, my dad's quoting Voltaire, close enough. All this idealism is a guideline. It is not a hard and fast rule. You have to have some kind of pragmatism in what you're doing. And remember that incremental progress is still progress. This can be hard if you don't necessarily have a clear deadline, but moving forward is a good thing. It doesn't matter how far, it doesn't matter how fast, just keep moving forward. For example, you can use a service locator. What? Fewer people know him, I guess. Service locators are evil. They bind your code to everything. Well, kind of. All a service locator is a passed dependency injection container. Take a dependency injection container, pass it to an object, great, now it's a service locator. That's the only difference. But you still now have stuff routing through that object. So this is progress. Remember, small steps. A service locator is better than a whole bunch of global functions you can't keep track of. And one global for that service locator is still better than 20. And yes, I think we had that many global variables in Drupal 7. I apologize. So this is a class that we have sitting in Drupal 8. We're using Symfony's dependency injection container, and we've got it in this static that we can just set and get from anywhere. Oh, look, a global. A global with a couple of utility methods to make it easy to use a global. Oh, God, why are you doing this? Because we do still have procedural code in the system, which you can't really dependency inject. So you access services from here instead. Incremental progress. For example, got random function out of our system. I'm not even sure if we still have this one, to be honest. But we're calling out to our global module handler service to call a method on it. Or the global plugin manager service to clear something. And this is gross. This is ugly. This is disgusting. But those services I'm referencing are still clean. Those are still cleanly injected. This code is ugly, but no uglier than it was before. The other code is cleaner. You can even do this in object-oriented code. Start off by taking your procedural code, dumping it into a class. This is step one. This is a good first step. At least you get autoloading. Then you can refactor that to see, to pull out those dependencies to internal methods. Okay, fine. And then you can shift that to fully dependency injected. And now we've removed our dependence on the container. Now this class is fully injected. Took a couple of steps to get there, but that's okay. A couple of steps is fine. We still got there. Service locators are a stepping stone towards DI. Here's where you want to be. You want to be doing full dependency injection on everything. You can get there slowly. Break things in steps. You're going to have backward compatibility shims. Otherwise, you have to change the entire code base all at once. When you change some functionality, deprecate the old API immediately. That means don't let anyone put in new code that uses the old one. And then spend the time to convert the old code to the new API. You may have heard this statement: nothing is more permanent than a temporary solution. This is completely true. And you have to commit to addressing it. You have to allocate time to cleaning up old APIs and porting to the new one. No new functionality happens there, but you have to do it, otherwise you're wasting your time. Management, listen up. How do you flag it? Well, you can use @deprecated. A lot of IDEs recognize this. And once you deprecate something, never add new usage of it, ever. Never let anyone do that, which means you're doing code review, right? Right? Good. Good documentation. In Drupal, we have change notices. They're a nice structured form that people can look up and analyze and read of, here's the API change, here's the new way to do this thing, now stop doing the old one. Peer review. I said you're doing code reviews, right? Right? Yeah. This is one we didn't do, but in PHP you can trigger euser deprecated, which normally doesn't do anything other than show up in your log and say, hey, by the way, stop doing it the old way. And have a sunset plan. What is your plan to get rid of the old code? Is it going to be a release blocker? Are you going to refuse to release the next version of the system until you fix this? Maybe, maybe not, but decide that explicitly. This also means that changes, patches, pull requests that are just removing legacy code must be acceptable. Whatever your process is, you have to say this is okay. Improving the quality of the code without adding new functionality has to be okay. Culturally, your process, you have to allocate time for it. It is not wasted time. You have to accept that it is not wasted time. Your management has to accept it's not wasted time. Time spent paying down technical debt is time well spent. Rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic is okay if they get you closer to a lifeboat. Early on in Drupal 8's dev cycle, we had a lot of cases where we'd post a patch that was refactoring something, really just moving code around, and our committers, our project leads would come back and say, there's no new functionality here, what's the point? Why are we bothering? Why are you creating work? Like, no, I'm not creating work. I'm trying to get us to the point where we can actually do something useful because we can't yet. And that slowed us down an awful lot, having those debates. The earlier you can get past that, the better. Culturally, you have to see code improvement, code quality improvement, as intrinsically valuable. Your dev team, your management team has to see the value in that. You have to view that as a good thing, not as wasted time. And if not, you need to get new managers. It also means don't bite off more than you can chew. Take case in point, our session handling. Obviously, we had our own session handling system in Drupal 7. For Drupal 8, we wanted to switch to symphonies because it was there. And we spent 2 years trying to do it in one big patch and never got it to work because it's gnarly and annoying. Instead, a group of people broke it up into over 10 patches over the course of 18 months. And we finally made it happen that way. It did not work to try and do everything at once. Most of these patches were just moving code around. Just moving code around from file to file, put stuff into classes to make it look kind of, sort of, maybe like the Symfony system so that it was easier to then rip out and replace with Symfony. That is time well spent. That is time very well spent. There are plenty of people working on other things in the same time. That's fine. Incremental improvement. Procedural code inside of a class is still improvement. May not be as far as you want to go, but it's still some kind of improvement. Let's look at our form system. Oh my God! This is the core of our form system. It has 10 dependencies. Good Lord! But now we know. It had 10 dependencies in Drupal 7 too. I just couldn't actually tell you how many there were because it was all procedural spaghetti. Now I know it has exactly 10 external dependencies. I can go, oh my God! And the old procedural system turned into just a bunch of wrappers around it, just calling out to that service. And then we remove those entirely after we no longer were calling them from anywhere. Incremental progress. Refactoring is an incremental process. No program is ever going to be perfect. No matter who's writing it, no matter how much work you put in, nothing's ever going to be ideal. Just make it better. Take time and make it better. Campfire rule. Leave the code better than you found it. That form builder class is disgusting, but it's injectable, which means we can unit test it slowly. It means all those other systems it's depending on, we can unit test. We can contain the crap. This is, we'll get back to it. It's okay. We actually have patches waiting already to simplify this. But all the code it's touching is fine. It's just touching an awful lot, which is still way better than it was before. And you need to know when to push for better and when to say, you know what, good enough. Perfect may be the enemy of the good, but good enough is the enemy of good too. When do you fight? When do you fight for doing it the right way, and when do you say, later? You need to pick your battles. My recommendation? It's worth fighting for good interfaces. It's worth fighting for the boundaries. It's worth fighting for that line in the sand behind which you can refactor. If the code behind an interface is disgusting, fine, you can get back to that. But by having that clear demarcation line, it means you can get back to it. You can get back to it separately from someone getting back to it over here. The most important thing in refactoring is simply separation of concerns, and interfaces are a great way of doing that, because it lets you refactor the grossness into smaller and smaller pieces and divide and conquer. And this can be a long and ongoing process. As I said, Drupal 8 started in 2011. I've been working on this effectively since 2008. Sometimes it will feel like you're just an uphill battle that never ends. But, as I said, refactoring is something that happens one bite at a time with friends. And if it seems hard, if it seems difficult, if it seems like you're not getting anywhere, just remember, Drupal, that isolated community of pretentious developers who always are convinced that their way is so different and so better than everyone else and don't want to share code with anyone else, do it their own way. If Drupal can take this step, if Drupal can refactor into a modern framework, a modern object-oriented system, if Drupal can embrace third-party code and modern development practices, so can you. Thank you.